group this morning. This is great. My name is Ray Johnson. You know me. I'm on the team here at Sonoma State. And today we get to look into the future with where we're going with wine and adapting and leveraging what we can do online. So to kick it off, to talk about the joy of wine, Leland's here with us from Simon Fraser University in Canada. Please, sir. And let's give him a round of applause.
I love it when you applaud and you don't know what you're going to get. All right, so this is we try to set the record for the greatest number of authors on a paper, and I think we came pretty close. So what I'd like to talk to you about is the joy of wine and how we can explore the emotions that are expressed on wine websites. As you know better than most people, wine is a very joyous product, and it is in the 15th Psalm, wine that maketh glad the heart of man. And from Proverbs, we're a very religious team that put this paper together. Wine should be given unto those that be of heavy hearts. We pretty much all know this. And here's one of my favorite quotes about wine from Jean-Michel Cazet of the great Lynch barge in Bordeaux. He says, wine is the only time machine that works. When you open a bottle of 1955 Lynch barge, what do you think about? You probably think that it was your grandfather that made that wine, and you then also start to think about who were the sports stars of the day, who were the politicians, what were the big movies, what was the music that people were listening to. So we know that wine is very much a product that evokes human emotions. So what I want to do today very quickly is a simple little paper, look very quickly at some of the literature on emotions and sentiment in marketing, and then describe a simple little study that we conducted really just to be able to play with a particular technique and a particular technology. The study itself is not particularly insightful as a study. It's really just as an illustration of showing a tool and some techniques that are available, and show you the results, talk about some of the limitations, what the implications for managers are, and what we may be able to do with this in terms of research in the future. So if you think about emotions, human emotions, what is an emotion? It's a mental experience that is high intensity and high hedonic content. And the best known, there's lots of different classifications of human emotions, probably the best known is Paul Ekman's classification. He identifies 6 basic human emotions: anger, disgust, fear, joy, the one we're interested in, sadness, and he also talks about surprise. We leave surprise out in this particular piece of research, and I'll tell you why in a moment or two. And then, of course, we've become really interested in the past few years, because of all the text data that is up there on the internet, we've become really interested in sentiment and sentiment analysis. Sentiment, a definition from a dictionary, is an attitude, thought, or judgment prompted by a feeling. And sentiment analysis has become a tool that we can use to make quantitative sense out of what is essentially qualitative data. So when you read a blog on a website, it is possible to quantify the sentiment expressed in that blog using various content analysis tools. Sentiment analysis obviously tries to determine the sentiment, which is sometimes also called the polarity of a piece of text. And as you can guess, the sentiment can range from positive to negative on whatever scale you choose to measure sentiment on. Different sentiment analysis software uses different scales. What are the relationships between emotions and sentiment? Well, it's unlikely that all of the emotions would impact sentiment significantly, and so it is worth knowing for any particular group of consumers or customers with emotions, which of the emotions have the greatest impact on sentiment. So, how did we do our sentiment analysis? And I think if you haven't come across this tool before, this is really cool. People are saying this will change IBM as a company. IBM has begun some years ago to invest very, very heavily into artificial intelligence and natural language processing. And what most people, certainly those who have grown up in North America or who live in North America, know most about, of course, is when Watson beat the Jeopardy champions. In 2011, when they were really getting the Watson project off the ground, IBM said, we would like to sponsor a competition where the two guys who had won the most money on the quiz show Jeopardy would compete against Watson. What is Watson? Watson is a massive supercomputer. It's probably the size of this room in the days when some of us can even remember when computers used to be the size of this room. This is actually one that is still about the size of this room. It has massive RAM. It has many thousands of gigabytes. I think it has a teraflop of RAM at the moment. It's just more than most of us can even begin to grasp. And what does that mean? It means you can store just about everything in its live memory, not on a disk, which makes it incredibly fast. And what else does it mean? It means that you can process incredibly fast, and it can access the information far quicker than a human brain can access this information. So for something like Jeopardy, what they essentially did is they stored the whole of Wikipedia in live memory, and all kinds of other information as well. The other beauty of this is that it uses natural language processing. In other words, it thinks like you and I do, it speaks like you and I do, and it understands language like you and I do. So think of Siri on your iPhone on steroids, and you've got close to what Watson is like. And so when Alex Trebek asks a Jeopardy question, Watson listens and understands it pretty much like a human being does. And what it then does is it searches all the information it has, and it then ranks the possible answers to the question. So it makes mistakes, it does get things wrong, but it doesn't guess unless the probability of being right is above a certain level. So if Watson is only 30% certain that it has the answer correct, it won't answer. But if it has two possible answers, one of which is about 85% certain and the other is about 70, it will probably go for the 85% certainty answer. And as it turned out, Ken Jennings, and I forget the other group, Ken and Brad were the two champions. These are the two guys that had won the most money ever on Jeopardy. Both of them had won over $1 million on Jeopardy. And Watson beat them roundly, very, very easily. And Watson won the Jeopardy challenge. For those of you who are interested, Ken Jennings has since become a speaker on how I got beaten by Watson. Because he says, all he's ever been good at is trivia quizzes, and now there's a computer that can beat him. He thought he was the best in the world, and now there's a computer that can beat him easily. And he says, is this a good thing or not? And he turns out saying it's a good thing. So, IBM didn't invent Watson or produce Watson so that you and I could watch Jeopardy quizzes. It was really a way of getting the idea across that natural language processing really works. And so the real value of a project like this lies in things like healthcare and medicine, for example. So if there's a particularly rare tumor in a cancer patient, an oncologist can access maybe 2 or 3 papers in a day or two, read them, study them, and start to make some decisions. Watson can read everything that's ever been written on this condition in the space of a few microseconds, and then can start to make recommendations. So that's the real power of this. But what they've also started to do is to build some tools for looking at text. And one of their tools is called Alchemy. And Alchemy has some really cool ways of looking at a piece of text and analyzing the emotions expressed in that piece of text, and also the sentiment expressed in that piece of text. So what did we do? We wanted to see how this played out. We chose 5 wine destination or tourist destination countries and regions. We wanted to get a rough mix of old and new world wine producers. So we chose France, old, South Africa, new old, and the US, New Zealand and Australia as new world wine regions. In 3 countries, we ended up looking at the entire country, the Southern Hemisphere countries, and in the 2 Northern Hemisphere countries, we ended up looking at particular regions or famous regions in those countries. So Bordeaux for France and Napa for the US. And so, how did we choose this? Very simply. We simply did a Google search and said, 10 best wineries to visit in South Africa, 10 best wineries to visit in Napa, 10 best wineries to visit in Bordeaux. That's all we did. So, are they the best wineries? That's what Google says. And so what we then did is we scraped the entire textual content of those sites. Some of them are pretty large files, you can imagine. There's one Napa winery that had well over a million words of text on the website, a few gigabytes when you try and store it. Now, if you think of trying to do any kind of manual content analysis of that, you'd still be busy. There's one Napa website, for example, that had more than 2.5 million words. These are they. This is what we came up with. Now, you look at these and immediately say, oh, that can't possibly be one of the best wineries in that region. Don't forget, it was the best wineries to visit according to Google search. That's all it is. So if you look at Bordeaux, for example, what do you immediately realize? There's no first growths on that list. And in fact, we ended up only using 8 out of the 10 wineries in Bordeaux because 2 of them were in French only, and we didn't want to get Watson confused by the French language. You'll also see, for example, that in Napa there are only 9, and that was because one of these wineries won't let you scrape it because you have to prove that you're over 21. And it just stops you from scraping if you do that. But it gives you an idea of who we were what we were looking at. And so here are the scores for the emotions expressed on these winery websites. So you can see the emotion of anger, pretty low overall. The emotion of disgust, pretty low overall. However, you see one scoring. Now this is on a 1. This is the scale going from 0 to 1. You say there's one of them that is expressing a high extent of disgust. What would that be? Why? Fear. One of them, while generally very low, one of them makes quite a considerable score on fear. Not unsurprisingly, joy is the emotion that is expressed most prominently on the majority of these websites. A little bit of sadness, I guess in the form of some kind of nostalgia, perhaps. And you can see that the sentiment ranges from -1 to +1. And you can see there's quite a big range from a -0.76 all the way up to a +0.91. So, what does this say? The other thing is you can see by region there's some quite large differences on sentiment. Average Napa sentiment higher than for example Bordeaux in New Zealand. Although on New Zealand quite a bit of variation. We tried a simple regression analysis just to see if we could predict the overall sentiment using these emotions. We found no significant relationships at all. And that kind of surprised us because we've done it with other websites in other fields and almost always come up with one emotion that is really strongly related to sentiment. For example, we did this in knee replacement surgeries, experiences that people had had, about 150 knee replacement surgery patients, and not surprisingly, the emotions that really hit sentiment was fear. We've done it with artists' websites, and not surprisingly, joy there is a significant predictor of the sentiment expressed. So we never found anything there. What are the managerial implications of something like this? We like to think that the real value of this is that we now have a methodology that is relatively simple and it's free. It's low cost is not really true, it's free. You can simply access the Watson website and you can do your own sentiment and emotions analysis. There's lots of other really cool tools that you can use there as well. For example, you can take a large piece of text and determine the personality of the composer or the speaker or the author of that piece of text. It uses the very famous Big Five personality traits and scores an individual on that. They're using it to look at the values that consumers express, for example, in reviews. And as I said, unless you have really big samples of text, it doesn't cost you anything. You simply enter the text into the Watson website and it'll process for you. I would have thought that evoking powerful emotions on a winery's tourism website is something that you would care about, and so it's possible to do that, and it's also possible to measure it. And I think where a website conveys an emotion, like that one that I showed you that had scored quite highly on disgust, you might at least want to think about what was happening. What words were being used that would score it so high on disgust? And in fact, what will allow you to do is then to go back through the whole piece of text and it will highlight why it was scoring high on that particular emotion. Similarly, that one, the one where I showed you it had expressed a negative sentiment on the website. Maybe there's a reason for that. When you put the website together and you write your text for your website, there's a reason you do want to express that kind of negative sentiment. But what if you didn't want to do that and it just happened by accident because you'd written it so badly, you probably want to fix it. So does your website express the kinds of emotions that you would want to be expressing? So obviously there's some limitations here. got a pretty small sample. I guess it's adequate for the kind of simple analyses that we wanted to do. But when you think of how many websites are out there and the relatively small number of estates we chose by country, there's not much more we can do with this paper. We also used a very simple rule of thumb for identifying these websites, and that was to put into Google 10 best websites, 10 best wineries to visit in a particular region. And simple statistical analysis, we didn't do anything funny. Obviously, you'd be concerned about multicollinearity between the variables or the emotions when you use them to predict something, because you will find some strong correlations between some of those emotions at certain times. So, some ideas for future research. How about looking at the emotions that consumers experience and website sentiment, and how this then starts to tie up with the actual offerings, the things that they consume. Again, looking at the winery websites that buck the trend, those that don't express high joy but express high sadness, for example, or that the one that was expressing high disgust. And you could also use all kinds of other content analysis tools. We've been using a piece of software called Diction quite a lot. It's really cool, it's really powerful, it's being used a lot because Diction gives you some really good scores that you can do all kinds of nice statistical analysis with. So, some ideas for the future. And then analysis of sentiment on other offerings that rely on high primary emotional responses, especially where wine is either marketed or consumed. So things like restaurants, things like campaigns against excessive alcohol, and so forth. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We're up against the clock. Any one quick burning question? Okay, thank you very much, sir. Yes. And next up from New Zealand, Sharon Forbes. Let's give her a round of applause.
I'll just leave it like that for a minute. So you're not actually going to hear from me very much this morning at all, which you might be quite happy about. So my colleague, David Dean, is very much into social media, and I'm not, I'm a dinosaur. I wrote the front end of the paper, he's done the analysis. So he said, Sharon, it'd be really cool if you could come along to this conference and actually do a live social media network analysis. And I went, yeah, no, I don't think so. So we've got a video that David is actually going to do an analysis of a social media network, focusing in on pinfolds, and I'll just play that and show you what we're talking about.
Okay, so my name's David Dean, and I'm sort of made this video because I wanted to show you a quick overview of what we're doing with Netlytics to look at social media mapping and to find out more about the tweets and Instagrams from our customers, and to see how our brands might be tracking on the social media networks. So it's a system, and thank you very much for Sharon presenting the paper. Sharon's done a lot of the front-end work to make sure that what we're doing is fits with the current literature, and I'm sort of running the background and the analysis. So sorry for this unsalubrious presentation, but I'm recording it on a lecture, empty lecture room, and so this is what we use to record our classes. So I thought it was the easiest way to come up with a universally playable file that she can play for you guys. So without going any further, this is Netlytic. It's a software that I found by talking to other people doing sociograms, and I found that this could be an excellent way for us to track social media for marketers. So you can see that I've got these databases. Now these databases are set up quite straightforwardly. You just go and say, here's what I want to search on, and here's the area I want to look at. I've got some Twitter, some Instagram, and even a Facebook group. And you can track these, and it goes out and collects this data hourly for as long as you want to. I think to a maximum of 10,000 responses. I've set the dates so that they were set to a 2-week period, and so the 2-week period was in August 2016. So I've been doing that, but this could go, you could collect this for months or years, offload what you don't use and combine it later and upload it again. So at the moment, I'm hitting my maximum of 5 data sets on a free, but of course if you pay money you can get larger data sets. It doesn't matter though, so we'll just go into it. Let's first start with what I did for the paper, which was looking at Pinfold's Twitter. So we click on Pinfold's Twitter, and what it does is it gives you a sort of preview of what all these tweets were happening during the time period. So we have August 6th, 7th, all the way to August 27th. So these, if we went through and looked at it, it's sort of overwhelming. So what we want to do is somehow, well, how can we do some sort of analysis to find out, well, what does it mean? How do we distill it down to some interesting information? So we start with doing a text analysis. And so when we do a text analysis, you can see how straightforward it is. It basically will collect all the different unique words that happened in that data set, and then we can look at those as word clouds. So we click on word clouds, and it tells us, okay, well, if we look at the top 30, here are the top 30 words that went alongside Penfolds. So we see some interesting things that I've remarked on in the paper. One is that we have Penfolds dinner. 50 people talked about that during this time period, and Mr. Keith Mann also was happening during that time period. And we have some things that we would expect to find, like Grange, Australian, Finlater, WSG. This was not quite as related in the first half of the time period, but certainly related to the second half. So Wolf relates to another news article that happens later about Wolf Blass and Penfolds. So if we click on Penfolds dinner, we can actually drill down and look at the tweets of what people are talking about. And they're saying about Penfolds Canunga Riesling. We can figure out the word that we chose. We can figure out who is actually sending the tweet. So this gives us an idea of what people are saying. We can look at those 50 items, and if we wanted to, we can do more analysis on that specifically. And we can also find that tweet and go and look at it on Twitter to see what it looks like in that sort of format. But for us, we need to look at this word cloud and we think, okay, well, this is interesting. This gives us, what's going on over time. We can also jump in and say, well, I want to broaden that to the top 100, and I can turn the estimated counts on and off. If I turn the filter on there, it just pops it up to 100. And we can go down and find that whereas the previous one dropped it at 50 or so, here we have ones that go down to 30, 16, 22, 18, so smaller numbers, which might be able to give us different words or a very specific response to something. So that's great. That gives us a way to look at, well, what other words are happening. If we wanted to look at this over time, we can also see how these words were tracking at different times during the data period. Now, what we can see here is that there were this Penfolds dinner, and what I know by looking at the tweets and going on to Twitter, I know that there was a big Penfolds dinner in Ireland. It was put on at the Culloden Estate. It was Keith Mann, who's a food and wine writer in Ireland, was there. He tweeted about as each one of the one of the courses came out, and it had, of course, a matched Penfolds wine with each course. So that was happening, the lead up to that was happening during this time period here. Then later in the week, Finlay or WSG is another Irish, I think it's an Irish wine merchant, and they had a big reveal of a Grange set, a set of Grange bottles in a special gift box, and they were doing a tasting of multiple Granges, and each one of the gift boxes was around 3,000 euros, I think it was. So these were sort of vintage Grange. So we can see that over time, we can see basically how the different activities have impacted on what people are talking about, especially with our brand. Great. So now we've got those sort of under control, and if we wanted to track brand and other, we could use this to track other brands compared to ours. We can see if we're mentioned together with sort of co-branding. We could also find out what are the typical descriptors that show up with our brand as well. So it's an interesting way to go through, and if you find something that's unusual and interesting, you can drill down and look at those individual tweets. So let's go back to our analysis, and we'll look at a different type of data set. In this case, we'll look at Instagram. Now, I've done the Twitter, in the paper, I've done the Twitter word cloud, but I've also done some sociograms. So let's have a look at the Instagram sociogram during this time. Now, I'm only supposed to use 5, but I can take from a larger database, which started before the time I wanted it to, and I can break it down to a particular time period, and that gives me the ability to focus in on a specific time period. I must have done the Penfolds, done that first, and therefore, when you go into Instagram, it picks up things that have happened in the last 2 weeks, so I wanted to limit it to just the same time periods. And now we've got these. Of course, the Instagrams are mostly focused on around pictures. So we wanted to look at the pictures. We could look at one of these pictures, go into and drop that link in. And this shows us what that particular one is. Some Instagram about Barossa Valley. It's a picture of a row of palm trees, and it's probably near one of the Penfolds, but that might be Penfolds finds there. So that's each one of those. We could link to whatever picture they're using, and we have their dates, and we also have what they were talking about. And you can see in a Instagram, it's very different. Sometimes most of the talking is done by the picture, and so the words are not nearly as descriptive as they are in a tweet, because a tweet often isn't linked to a photo. And so here we have excellent, very cool, smiley face. That means that when we look at our text analysis, usually the text analysis are not as useful in an Instagram because so much of the word cloud is sort of these extra words: epic, wine time, wine tasting, wine country, wine and dine, awesome, beautiful, birthday. You can see that they're things which are either related to wine drinking or specific to a particular, like McGill Estate or Canoga Hill, a brand. This is the one of the wineries. Brand again, and Australian wine, Australia, Adelaide. So all of these things you can see, but they're all sort of snapshots, and they're sort of hashtags or shortened versions of what people associate with it, instead of a tweet which might give you a full sentence or a more complicated idea. The complex ideas here are shown in the photos. But what we can do in in this is look at a network analysis. And we can do this in the tweets as well, but I thought I would just mix it up. Here we have a network analysis, and we have two options that we can use in a network analysis. The first option is called a name network. And a name network is when you name someone else. So we can see that a name network is based on people in the network. These are the nodes, and when they name someone else, that's called a tie. And so we've named the someone who's mentioned Penfold somewhere in their Instagram, but we've named it, each one of the people in there was naming someone else, or they could be responding to it. So, which when you actually are directing a message, it changes from a name network to a chain network. And so a name network is when we're actually naming something, and a chain network is when we're actually directing our comment. Now, in Twitter, it's quite difficult. If you don't name someone that you're retweeting or something, then there's not much that you're directing. But in Instagram, if you comment on someone's photograph, then that's seen as a directed post. And so the directed post goes back to that particular, the person who sent that Instagram photo in the first place. So what we can do in a name network is when people are naming each other, we can have a quick visualize of, well, what does this look like for this 2-week data period? And when we look at this 2-week data period, we can see that Penfold is here in the middle. We've got BJRLE Bouquet. This is a German wine distributor, so they were having some sort of event. They had someone from Penfold's coming to one of their wine tastings, and so that's why they featured. Each one of these lines is when someone has named someone else. So we can zoom in and find these particular links, and we find, and what Netlytics does is it tries to put them into networks where each network, dominated by a central node, is in a different color. So if we wanted to look at some of these networks, we could say, well, what does Netlytics use for its first cluster? We can take the other clusters out, and we find with a big cluster. First is this Penfolds. We can have a look at that and see, well, this is what it's considered to be Penfold's domain in terms of this cluster. And we can look, by clicking on it, we can figure out all the different ones which have either responded to Penfolds or Penfolds has responded to them. In this case, we can look at the in degree and the out degree, and basically we can tell us that for this Penfolds, the 25 namings that were happening were in degree, so they were naming Penfolds. It wasn't Penfolds naming someone else. So this is, now we know a direction. We know that these different people are naming Penfolds in their Instagram posts. And if we go, we can look at the Dallas Wine Club had a tasting, and this is a group Texas Sommelier. This is Lynn P, which is one of the Penfolds ambassadors, who is operating, I think, in California, but perhaps he went to the Dallas Wine Club meeting. And then, of course, we have Penfolds is the one that's being named. So we can drill down and look at each one of these and figure out, okay, well, what's going on in this particular network? What's happening there? Let's look at those people. Let's put together a picture on what was going on. So what it does is it allows us to go and find all kinds of information that we can then track over time periods, because we can limit our databases to 1 week, 2 week, 3 days, the time of an event. And that gives us an incredible amount of power to find out, well, what are people actually talking about our particular brands. We can also look at the chain network, where we find that these people were actually sending a message to a particular group or member. And again, the same thing happens as we zoom in. We find that we can find individuals that have sent messages. We could look at those, the individual tweets, and find out exactly what they were talking about. There's a notion of people that are talking, having a conversation. Typically what you'll find is that the conversations have tweets which are going back and forth. So we don't see many of them here. A tweet or Instagram that would have going back and forth would look like sort of two lines, one going below and the other one going back, and that would indicate sort of an ongoing conversation. But these look quite sort of one way. Somebody sends something to someone else. In Twitter, you find much more sort of directed conversations where people retweet somebody and then they make a comment or they direct a response to a particular person and so on. But in Instagram, we find that it's sort of a lot more one-way communication with an added yes or you go or wherever you want, whatever they comment on. And we find that in this one, the main the cluster 1 is mostly an out-degree cluster, all sent by Mount Michael Wines. And they've sent something out to a number of other Instagram members. We can have a quick look and see if we can find out what that meant, what that said. Sweet. So, this is an example of someone who mentioned something that they got from Mount Michael Wines, and Mount Michael Wines replies to it with a one-word response. Basically, we're here, cheers, and more sweets, cheers. So if those mean something, then they can give us some sort of insight into what was going on at that particular time. Right, so where does that leave us? It really is hope that you sort of get an idea of what you can do. It's more of a visual type approach. Most of the, well, all of the heavy lifting is done by Netlytics, and so it's a matter of you entering the data, or having Netlytics scour the data, and then you come in the end and say, well, what have we got? So it's something that if you have winery clients, or I've used it in the marketing research class where people are expected to find out, well, tell us what the most, what has the most buzz this week regarding a particular brand. And so we can send the students into here. They all can set up their account and get 5, I think they start with 3 databases, but that's usually enough for teaching. And they go in and find information about these people, and they'll drill down and find a couple of the tweets and the Instagrams which they think were the most popular that particular time period. And that gives us some, well, a nice way to sort of scour the social media to see what's you.
We might stop there because I know we're going to go over time. So look, just to summarise, I guess this isn't a normal sort of research paper at all. This is very much, as Leyland talked about as well, this is a free tool that is out there that, especially for wineries, and I think we've got a few visitors in the room today, that for wineries, this tool's there, you can actually do some analysis and figure out what is going on in terms of various social media networks and your brand name or your winery name. And so in particular, we think that wineries could actually establish some sort of baseline presence in these various social media tools. So kind of get a picture of where your baseline is. And then if you put out a new strategy, so say you're having an event, you could then monitor the social media and see whether that event that you posted out through social media, whether it did create a buzz. So were people talking about it? Were they passing on messages to others? The other thing you can use this for is to really identify those really influential key people in your social media network. So who are those people that are always passing on messages that you send out, that seem to like your winery, and then try and form a relationship with those people. They're going to talk about you and they're doing it for free. So, and that's really where I'd probably finish up. Just if you've got something interesting to say about your winery, other people are going to pass that along. And they're doing the marketing for you. So that's where I'll finish it up. I'm not an expert on this analysis side of things, but I've got David Dean's business cards here, so if anybody's got any questions, I can just pass you a business card. It's probably the best way to handle it. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Chair, thank you. Okay. Who's up next? Is it Natalie or Chris? Better you handle it.
Yes, sorry.
There you are. That's okay. It's the first time we've met.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice to meet you again. Oh, Rachel. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. And Natalie,
Yes.
you're all the way from what part of France?
Okay, so I live in Champagne, but I'm originally from Montreal.
Wow.
You say all like it's a bad thing. I
No,
live in Champagne.
it's so hard, isn't it?
It's
Oh,
hard, yeah. It's
Well-
hard to live in Champagne. Plus, my husband is here and he owns the best wine cellar in France, so I don't have to pay for my champagne.
Wow, that is great. Well, let's give Natalie a great round of applause.
So, thank you. What I'm going to be presenting today is a bit different from what I presented yesterday, which I don't know if some of you were in my session yesterday. I was talking about sustainability, and now I'm going to talk about telepresence, which is a completely different thing. This is a project that I did with one of my colleagues, Kirsten, and then two of our master's students. And it's an extension of research that I've been working on for a couple of years. Last AWVR in Adelaide, I presented a first version about telepresence, which I don't know if you are familiar with the concept, but let me basically go to this slide here. So what we were looking at, and this is something that I've been doing with the city of Reims, which I know most of you are like, what? So Reims, okay. It's not an acronym, it's actually a place, and in French we say Reims, which I still can't say properly. But so I work with the city on territorial attractivity in the sense of, you know, how do we get people to come for the place rather than just the product, because everybody knows Champagne, nobody knows Champagne as a place, and certainly nobody knows where Champagne is relative to Paris as a place and so on. And there's a lot of things that are happening in the city other than Champagne. And a lot of tourism activities that circulate around the concept of Champagne, like cellar visits, for example. So, you know, we're not as good as New Zealanders and we're not as good as Americans in terms of creating enotourism activities, and there's a lot of structural reasons for that as well. But the idea was, you know, how do we get people to want to come to the city? And so some of my previous work looked at, you know, what if we use things like virtual reality as a tool? So we see Google 360-degree applications, for example, where we can see, you know, I can turn around, I can zoom in, I can zoom out, I can maybe click on videos on the side. What does that actually do? Does that help consumers, you know, sort of create a better attitude, more desire, maybe less of a risk? And so this is kind of an offshoot of this project because we looked at a specific application, which is why I'm holding my iPad here. Hi, Armand, didn't see you. Okay. So the idea was basically to understand if product knowledge, for example, influenced sensory marketing activities, because telepresence and virtual reality are technically sensory marketing activities that you can create. You have to get people who can touch your product, right? They can either touch your product or they can actually touch the application. And it's the idea of, you know, does it actually influence brand evaluations? And what we really looked at is on applications that can create telepresence. Videos are really one way, right? I take in, the advertiser is the one who decides of what he's going to show me in a video. When you're using online applications like 360, it's the consumer who decides what they're going to be doing. So it's much more of a two-way, and it's a much more consumer-directed experience. And then we wanted to look at what was the role of consumer imagination, because the idea of telepresence, it's kind of like flow, but it's above flow. So just as a reminder, flow is you go to the movie theaters, you're so immersed in the content, and then when the movie is over, you look at your watch and you go, I didn't even realize that 2.5 hours just went by. You know, Hoffman and Novak look a lot at flow online, that you can have websites where, you know, you don't even realize that it's been 3 hours and so on. Telepresence is a step above. It's really having the impression that you are in a place or doing something virtually, but having the impression you're actually doing it in reality. Okay? This is where the virtual reality as the managerial tool steps in. So, very quickly, a bit of literature review. So we know that in terms of sensory marketing activities and initiatives, visualizing, manipulating, interacting with content leads to higher brand evaluations, and also it leads to a sentiment of endowment, ownership, and especially a higher intent to purchase. So all this previous research gave us a little bit of insight in terms of what we could expect a 360-degree application to do. Knowing that most research does not specifically look at 360 applications for now, okay? And telepresence specifically we would expect would come out of 360 because telepresence is a reward-like sense of presence in an environment that gives you the impression that it's like a natural experience. So what we focused on in this project was Arena, which is a champagne house in ice, which now obviously my iPad has turned off. And they had a cellar application which basically leads you down into their cellars. Okay, and I'm going to show it to you in a little bit. But that's why the focus is on Arena specifically, because they had one specific application that we could really fiddle around with. Because I know that there's a couple winery managers here. You may be aware that creating 360-degree applications is a little bit more expensive than creating a video. And so not a lot of houses actually have 360-degree videos. Then we also looked at things like sensory combinations. So these sort of, video will have visual, it'll have sound potentially, but it won't necessarily have haptics. But we do know that sensory combinations do lead to higher persuasion, more emotional attachment, and specifically virtual reality, because it leads to flow and these sort of cognitive processes, leads to deeper information processing, which is good, because it leads to more information intake by the consumer. We don't want them to look at our offer peripherally, we want them to look at it from a central sort of aspect, to go deep in terms of their knowledge acquisition. But can you, on the alternative, can you have this sort of compounding positive effect, or can you have an overload effect? And this is an important aspect to consider. And then obviously, how important is the role of imagination? Imagination integrates existing knowledge with new information, but it's supposed to lead you, kind of like telepresence leads you to feel like you're in another space. Can it lead you also to imagine even bigger or better things about what it is that you're seeing? So very quickly, our conceptual theory and our hypothesis. Okay, what we looked at was essentially if somebody looked at a video versus the application, which I'm going to show you, would they be more likely to purchase the wine brand that was, the content, or that was, sorry, I'm tired, eh? It's hard with the 9 hours. Of the brand that is the subject of the video or of the application. Will they have higher attitudes? How does product knowledge, because all of us like champagne, but not all of us know a lot about champagne. Champagne is expensive as well, so not a lot of people can buy it on an everyday basis, and that influences how much knowledge they have about it. And then does imagination mediate the relationship between the interaction of product knowledge and what we call telepresence, which is the application on product evaluation, such as attitudes and purchase intentions. I'm going very quickly, but I know that the presentations and so on are going to be available, or at least the abstracts are going to be available, and I will be here so we can talk about it more in detail. So the first thing we did, this is where our students came in. So the first student decided to examine how telepresence, so the act of actually having the application, influences wine brand perceptions. So he was French, and he was doing his studies in Ireland, and so he interviewed half of his sample in Ireland and the other half in France, but we didn't find any significant differences. But it was interesting because it allowed us to have a little bit more validity. And the second study, what we did is a replication with an American panel on MTurk, and we looked at product category knowledge and as a moderator, and we looked at imagination as a mediator. So study one, 128 consumers. This is the application. Don't know if you will be able to see it properly, okay? So basically, you walk down the stairs, okay? And as you hold the iPad, if you tilt the iPad up or down, I don't know if you can see it, it moves with you, as if this was, you. So if you look up, you'll see the ceiling. If you look to the side, you have to tell me if you're seeing it. Yeah. So we had two conditions. So the student, apparently wealthy enough to buy a Blanc de Blanc from Arena, went into the streets with a bottle of Arena, and either just had people look and touch at the product, or people looked at the product and also saw the application on his iPad or on his iPhone. And we just measured very quickly, purchase intentions, brand attitudes, and product category knowledge with just 2 items. Here's a picture again of the application. So this you can download on the App Store. It's free, but it only works on iPads and on iPhones. It doesn't work on like your regular computer. And the results are fairly interesting. It basically shows that there's no significant difference between the nationality of the consumers, so that's fine. We have an entire sample. And we actually see that if you have touching the product and the application, we see that attitudes are higher and purchase intentions are also higher. So that means that if you can combine, and this is interesting because you can put one of these at your point of purchase. And that allows consumers to actually have a better understanding, not just of, here's this product, I don't know how it's made, it seems magical, I don't know where it's made, I don't know why it's so expensive. Well, if I can show you that it actually has to live here for 13 months to 3 to 6 years, you might understand more the quality of the product as well as why it should cost so much. The second study was where we replicated, but we did it online. So Rena has a similar video available on YouTube where they do their seller visits, so we use that as a comparison. And here we had 228 American consumers. We paid them to participate on MTurk. And then we also measured the same DVs in order to have replicability. We used the same moderator, and we also included mental imagery, which was our, it's actually not a moderator, it's a mediator, but that was our measure for imagination. And then we also put in a couple covariates just in case, things like brand loyalty and if they had previously purchased Reno, just to have a better idea. So first what we did was process to see if there was any sort of moderation going on. And what we actually do see is that knowledge does have an impact in terms of brand attitudes, and but not so much on purchase intentions. So there was some sort of an influence in terms of knowledge. So that's important to know, because when we get into segmentation, it means creating two different types of programs for your consumers who know and your consumers who don't know. This is the same thing in anything that we do when we talk about wine marketing, even in terms of labeling. For example, you don't talk the same way on your back label to consumers with knowledge as you do with consumers with little knowledge. And we see actually that in terms of the application, knowledge negatively influenced purchase intention. And that's interesting because it's almost like, if I know a lot about the product, I probably don't actually need you to give me extra information. Like, I know this information already. I don't need to imagine it. I don't need extra. It almost seems like when we get into this is helping me when I'm looking at the video, but here you're giving me an idea of like too much information. It's like sensory overload potentially. We also looked at our covariates. So loyalty was a significant covariate. We would expect that, obviously, because people are very loyal to champagne brands, like, or if you're Barry, you're just loyal to champagne as a category, right? And then we also noticed that champagne knowledge did not affect attitudes when viewing the virtual tour, but knowledge did have a significant and positive effect on purchase intentions. So we see that what this basically means overall, because I know we're going to move on to another presentation, but it basically tells us that not all consumers are alike, not all consumers will react the same way when it comes to applications online. So we have this idea that all applications are great, that we should all move towards technology, but considering who your consumers are and how much knowledge they have might be of relevance. And specifically, the role of imagination. So this was a significant predictor of attitudes and purchase intention. And it actually basically allows for the consumer, this is really important, is the application, although you have to be careful in terms of product knowledge, we know that the process mechanism is that it allows consumers to go there. So it kind of proves our telepresence premise. I kind of use that interchangeably in terms of application and telepresence, but we assumed that the application would lead to more telepresence. And here, what we're showing is that it actually does in a way that allows the consumer to have more imagination, which explains why they like the product more and why they're more likely to purchase it. From a personal perspective, I think this is really important, especially if you're selling a destination or a product that comes from a place away or far from where your consumer is. If I'm in Paris and I know where Champagne is, the imagination might not be as important, but if I'm in France and I'm coming to Sonoma, that imagination allowing me to imagine what it might be like will probably motivate much more my intentions to come or to purchase the product. So, very quickly, telepresence basically allows you to better communicate a brand story. And this is a critical component, right? We saw in Leland et al.'s presentation, that brand stories can be very long, they can be very short. Everybody creates their brand story. It can be really hard for consumers to read 2.5 million words on a website. If you can do it in pictures, if you can do it in moving pictures, and if you can do it in applications, then it might allow consumers to better understand your brand story. Also kind of create their own brand story with you through imagination. And this is important because in terms of store aisles, I mean, if you've been in French grocery stores and you see the French wine aisles, I mean, it's like, how does a consumer make that decision? I would almost argue, because I know there's some winemakers in the room, if you guys are marketing a product that has, some sort of, like, for example, American sparkling, American champagne, and French champagne in the aisle, how does the consumer make sense of those three products, which are somewhat similar but maybe not alike? You can maybe do that in the store aisle with some sort of telepresence-inducing application. When consumers have high knowledge, it seems that their knowledge suffices to result in more positive brand evaluations. So this is basically saying, if you go to my husband's store and you want to put your wines in my husband's store where consumers have a lot of knowledge, then you don't need to create an application. If you are going in a grocery store where most,
for example, from the US, I would like to ask if this is an example to follow. In French, le meilleur divertissement chez vous. In nowadays, when you want to use Amazon apps, it's not for buying, it's not for doing shopping, it's only to get some entertaining time. So they are transforming the act of buying and shopping into an act of having fun, thanks to games, thanks to music, and thanks to devices which will show you even bigger pictures. There are some limits. The use of students for the sample, the use of only 2 m-commerce stores and 2 apps selling wine, so they should not represent exactly the entire market. And the further studies that I should recommend could focus on the relationship between the presence or absence of the delivery system. It's very, very common nowadays in Paris that you can select any type of restaurant and get delivered very, very easily. So why not thinking about location-based system in order to speak more local and get the wine from your wine growers who is producing close to your neighborhood and be delivered this way. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks. We're good on time. Questions, Suzanne?
Well, which ones were the apps that you used in the e-commerce stores?
News, I will give you the name. There are 2 apps that have been used, which were dedicated for the selling of wine through the application.
If we just ask this room here, how many people have ever bought wine from an app? Put your hand up. And how many have bought wine online? It's quite interesting. Just on the research, I just think as a point, I think we're in the real world of this. We're rebuilding our app right now, and what we found was that the single intent was way more important than all of these other factors. It was, what does the app do for me? So in our case, snaps the label, recognises the wine, shows the critic score, shows where I can buy it.
Yeah.
Simple. Don't clutter it up with all this other stuff,
But
particularly for an app.
at the same time, for privacy purpose, I think that many people are not ready to be proposed this type of service. I would like, because I have eaten that, because I am a little bit ill, because I have been walking for 3 miles yesterday, that my app tells me you shouldn't drink wine today, wait for the next day. Or examples such as you should drink this wine rather than this wine, it's healthier for you. This type of recommendations that might occur in the next future are not very
We see
accepted
different
by
use cases
consumers.
for us about mobility and location. Because you're out, you're going to do something different than if you're at home, and that's the driver for the app quite differently than that. But yeah, so anyway, we've just gone through this reality, and that we decided that was the key factor, was the use case. The what do you want to do when you're out, when you've got your wine in front of you, and that was our guide.
Terry?
I think there are two different uses for this, right? And it affects the app. And maybe if you had an app trying to sell wine, that would become like the first breaking point. Here's a wine I want. How do I buy it? The other is I want to find a wine to buy and search for it. And those are completely two different approaches to buying wine. And I would think two different.
And there are many
uses.
others which
And
stores happen at the time I want to drink wine.
Right, and what are they carrying? It's like, I want wine. Now, how can I get it easily? What can I get? And then I'll make a choice among those things, right? Yeah, so it seems like the consumer's approach to what is that search? What are they trying? What's their motivation or situation for buying would affect whether an app would work well for them or not.
And that this is close to what we call the thinking style, which means I am more utilitarian, I am more hedonist, I feel in this type of mood. So I think that the next hats will have to detect your the water in your hand or the temperature of your hand to give the hats another sense of mood.
Liz, yeah.
Yeah, just to comment, first of all, this is fascinating. I wish I could cut the whole thing. But I was in China a month ago in Shanghai, and a lot of people were using, I don't know what the app was, but on their phone to buy wine. WeChat. I use WeChat all the time, but I don't know if they were buying wine with WeChat. But they literally were, it's amazing what they're doing there. You can buy the wine on your phone, and it gets delivered to your door within as short as 3 to 4 hours, and it only costs maybe $1. And so many people are using that to get wine, and it's just, I was like, when is that going to happen here?
Is it providing other
Yeah,
services
not
or just
for-
wine?
Not for $1.
Well, that's true.
And not in 4 hours.
Yeah.
But it
No,
is
so,
happening.
but we hope it will happen soon, but yeah, not yet here. Not with our regulations in the United States, but, yeah.
Other questions for Sean here? Are there other questions as well that have percolated for the first, second, and third presentation after seeing all four together? Okay.
I also think you need to sample, not students. I think you've got to have wine buyers as the sample, because the students are not represented.
But they were not students.
Oh, I thought it said.
Maybe more than 40 years old. So.
Oh, I thought you picked that up as at the end.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of the day. Have a great day. The break starts soon.